A child sketches a murder no one witnessed, except the killer. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. I'd love to hear from you. Comment below with where you're listening from. Your voices make this community feel alive. It was in the closing days of November, with a damp fog rolling off the Thames and London settling into its habitual winter melancholy, that a knock at the door of 221B Baker Street interrupted a rare moment of peace. Sherlock Holmes, deep in his armchair and fiddling absently with his Stradivarius, looked up without curiosity. I, for my part, had just set aside the Morning Chronicle, which had carried little of interest beyond the usual Parliament squabbles and the news of a society. "Wedding, come in," Holmes called without rising. "You will find Mr. Holmes within and unsuitably idle." The door opened to admit a man in a charcoal overcoat with a velvet collar. His eyes were quick and alert, though weighed down by anxiety. I judged him to be in his mid-40s, with the unmistakable upright bearing of a former military man. He carried under one arm a rolled sheaf of papers, and under the other a look of great urgency. "Mr. Holmes," he said, doffing his hat, "I am Colonel Julius Mortimer. I come to you on behalf of Lady Daphne Carrington. There's been a most troubling affair at her estate in Hampstead, and Scotland Yard, pardon the frankness, has been, in a word, stumped." Holmes nodded without shifting his position. "Then it is fortunate that your search for competence brought you to my door. Pray sit, Colonel. You appear to be under some duress." "I am. A man is dead, a trusted manservant, Arthur Beckett. But that, tragic as it is, isn't the strangest part." Holmes arched a brow. "Do go on." Mortimer unrolled the papers with a practiced hand and placed one of them on the table between us. It was a child's drawing, crude but detailed, rendered in colored pencils. It depicted a scene in a parlor, a man slumped backward in a chair, a red blotch across his chest. A fireplace to the left, an open window to the right, and most strikingly a shadowy figure drawn in black just behind the chair. This was drawn by Lady Carrington's 7-year-old grandson, Thomas. The boy was found sitting on the floor of the study yesterday morning. Drawing this with singular focus, he has not spoken a word since. Holmes finally set down his violin. "The study? That's where the body was found." "Yes, precisely as the drawing shows. Down to the open window and the blood on the cravat. What's more, the servants swear the room was locked from the inside and the windows bolted. No one saw anyone enter or exit during the night. Beckett was found just as you see him there." Holmes leaned forward, inspecting the drawing with narrowed eyes. "You believe the child may have witnessed the murder?" Mortimer hesitated. "We don't know. The child has a vivid imagination, but he has never drawn anything so macabre. Lady Carrington is deeply disturbed. She fears for the boy's mind. And to add to the strangeness, the constables found no footprints outside the window, though the earth was soft with last night's rain. Nor was there any sign of forced entry. No valuables were taken." "Quite the conundrum," I murmured. Holmes tapped a finger on the table. "Colonel, describe Beckett for me." "Efficient, loyal, 32, served in the household for 5 years, no known enemies, devoted to the child. He often read to young Thomas in the evenings." "Was the boy in the habit of sketching?" "Oh yes, constantly. Castles, pirates, animals, but never anything like this." Holmes stood abruptly. "Watson, fetch your coat. We're going to Hampstead." The Carrington estate, a wide Edwardian manor nestled at the edge of Hampstead Heath, was half swallowed by fog when our cab reached it. Colonel Mortimer led us through the entryway, where a butler with a haggard face gave us a silent nod. The atmosphere within was thick with tension. No one spoke above a whisper. A house in mourning and in fear. Lady Daphne Carrington awaited us in the drawing-room. She was a stern-looking woman in her 50s, with grey eyes that had clearly not known sleep-in days. "I'll speak plainly, Mr. Holmes," she said. "My grandson is all I have left. If he saw something that night, I dread to think what it's done to him. He won't eat, he won't speak, he just draws." Holmes inclined his head solemnly. "May I see him?" She hesitated. "Of course. But be gentle." The child Thomas was sitting cross-legged on the carpeted floor of his bedroom, his back to us, hunched over another piece of paper. A collection of pencil stubs was scattered about him. He did not look up when we entered. He was sketching again, swift, methodical strokes. I noted the faint tremble in his hand. Holmes crouched beside him. "May I look?" he asked, not touching the paper. The boy paused but gave no response. Holmes studied the drawing. Another scene. The same parlour, but this time it showed Beckett standing alive facing a tall man in a coat. There was a clock on the mantelpiece. Its hands pointed to 10 minutes past 11. Without warning, Thomas flipped the page and began drawing again. Holmes stood. He is communicating, not with words, but with memory. "Is that the time of the murder?" I asked. Mortimer shook his head. "The constable who examined the body placed death between 11:30 and midnight." Holmes tapped his lip with a finger. "Curious. Do you believe the boy saw something, Mr. Holmes?" Lady Carrington asked softly. Holmes' expression was unreadable. "I believe, Lady Carrington, that your grandson may have seen everything." The hansom cab had scarcely begun its descent from Hampstead Hill before Holmes lapsed into one of his peculiar silences, his chin buried deep within the folds of his Inverness cape, eyes hooded beneath the brim of his deerstalker. The only sign that his mind was not adrift, but in furious motion, was the rhythmic tapping of his long fingers against the side of the cab, as if they beat time to some internal logic. I let him be. After years as his companion and chronicler, I knew better than to intrude during these intervals of intense deduction. Instead, I allowed my thoughts to wander back to the drawing the child had made, so eerily accurate, so grotesquely calm. How had Thomas come to reproduce a murder scene with such precision? And if he had witnessed it, why had no one heard him cry out? Why did he retreat into silence and sketches? When we returned to Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson greeted us with a steaming pot of tea and her usual solicitous glance at Holmes, whose pallor had deepened under the gaslight. He waved away the tea, strode directly to the fireplace and stood with his back to it, hands clasped behind him. "Watson," he said, not turning, "you noted the detail of the mantel clock in the second drawing." "Yes." It indicated 10 past 11. "Quite so, and the police estimate the time of death as no earlier than 11:30, which means the child drew a moment before the crime took place. That seems to suggest he was reconstructing a memory, not a mere fancy." "Indeed, and yet the accuracy of that memory is astonishing. Consider, Watson, the symmetry of the furnishings, the orientation of the body, even the detail of the fire grate and window latches. Such fidelity can only come from intimate familiarity with the room or a recent direct observation. Then the boy was present at some point during the murder, possibly, or else he was shown the aftermath and has been compelled by some inner force to return to it over and over again. Children do not process trauma as adults do. Their minds seek to understand through repetition. But there is more, much more." Holmes reached into his coat and removed the first drawing, the one Mortimer had shown us in our sitting room, and spread it out on the table. "Note the position of the figure behind the chair." "The shadowy one?" "Yes, I saw it at the time. It seemed to suggest the killer was standing behind Beckett when he was stabbed." "Very good, but look closer. See this?" He pointed to a smudge near the fireplace. "At first glance, it seems an accidental mark, perhaps a child's careless stroke. But it is, I believe, intentional. It resembles smoke or soot." And now recall what Mortimer said. The windows were bolted, the doors locked from within. No sign of intrusion. I leaned over the image, peering more intently at the grey mark Holmes had indicated. "You believe the murderer came down the chimney?" Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Watson, I believe no such thing. I merely observe that the child suggests something was amiss in that quarter. That grey patch is the only area of the picture without a definite human form. It may represent smoke, a hidden object, or something else entirely, but in art even that of a child placement matters." I frowned. But what possible mechanism could allow for a locked room murder without disturbance? The windows were bolted, no footprints. The servants heard nothing, and yet Beckett was found with a wound that bled profusely. "Exactly, which leads me to propose that the murder did not occur in the manner assumed. Watson, I suspect the wound was not immediately fatal." I sat back. "You believe he was attacked elsewhere, perhaps drugged or wounded, and staggered into the study." Before collapsing, Holmes's eyes gleamed. That, or he was lured there by someone he trusted, someone who knew the house, the habits of the residents, and the movements of young Thomas. At that moment there came a soft knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson opened it with an apologetic smile. "A note, Mr. Holmes, from Colonel Mortimer, marked urgent." Holmes took it with a murmur of thanks and unfolded it swiftly. As he read, his brow furrowed. "What is it?" I asked. "A development. Lady Carrington's footman has been found unconscious near the stables. A blow to the head, no robbery. His purse and watch were untouched. Another attack? Perhaps. But note the timing. Only a few hours after our visit. Someone is either tying up loose ends or sending a message." He turned and seized his coat again. "Where are we going?" "Back to Hampstead, Watson. There's something in that house or near it that our killer fears we'll find, and I mean to find it before they strike again." We returned to the Carrington estate under cover of darkness, arriving just past 9. Colonel Mortimer met us at the door, his face tight with unease. "He's in the kitchen," he said, leading us swiftly through the halls. "His name's Patrick. Been with us 2 years, loyal as they come. Someone struck him from behind just as he stepped outside to fetch coal." Holmes knelt beside the dazed young man who was nursing a bandaged scalp. "Did you see your attacker?" he asked. Patrick shook his head. "No, sir, it was sudden, just a flash behind me and then darkness." "Anything unusual before that? Any sounds? Shadows?" Patrick hesitated. "Now that you mention it, I did hear something odd, like a thump in the laundry room, but when I looked in it was empty." Holmes nodded, already rising. "Show me the room." We were led down a narrow corridor to a side wing. The laundry was cold and dim, the smell of damp linens heavy in the Herr Holmes swept the space with a quick but thorough gaze. Then he crouched. "Watson, bring the lantern closer." He pointed to a smudge of dark powder near the skirting board. "Soot," I said. "Yes, but look beyond that." Nestled behind a loose panel in the wall was a narrow iron pipe, barely wide enough for a hand to fit inside. "A speaking tube?" I asked. "Precisely. Likely used by staff to communicate with the upper floors." Holmes's fingers traced the pipe upward. "Let's see where this leads." With Mortimer's reluctant blessing, we ascended to the first floor where Holmes found the pipe's other end, concealed behind a panel in the study's bookshelf, mere feet from the fireplace. "Watson," he murmured. "The study wasn't as sealed as we thought. So the killer used the pipe to deliver poison or gas. Not poison, but perhaps a signal, something to summon or manipulate. Remember the soot on the drawing? The child indicated the fireplace area, and now we find this connection, hidden from all but the most observant." He straightened. "I believe we are closing in. There is one more thing we must do before the truth can be forced to the surface." "And that is?" Holmes's eyes glittered in the lamplight. "We must speak with the child. One last time." We found young Thomas once more in his bedroom, sitting cross-legged on the floor, his back to the door and his colored pencils spread around him like the scattered pieces of a puzzle. A fresh drawing lay before him, partially complete. Holmes approached with his characteristic silence, but I noticed he paused this time, not out of caution, but out of what I dare say was a flicker of respect. "Thomas," he said gently, lowering himself to the carpet, "you are very clever. I see you are drawing again." The boy did not speak, but his hand stilled mid-stroke. "I wonder," Holmes continued, "if I might ask your help. You have already helped so much. This one," he nodded toward the earlier drawings Holmes had brought with him from Baker Street, "told me what happened that night better than any adult could." Thomas remained motionless, but his eyes flicked sideways, watching Holmes. "I noticed something," Holmes went on, producing the drawing of the parlor where Beckett lay dead. "Here, this figure behind the chair. You drew it in black. The others are full of color, but this one is like a shadow. Was this a man you saw?" Still the boy said nothing. Holmes placed another drawing beside it, the second one of Beckett speaking with a tall man in a coat, the mantel clock reading 11:10. "You remembered the time very carefully," Holmes said. "That was well done. But this man here," he pointed at the tall figure, "was he the same as the shadow behind the chair?" A pause. Then Thomas slowly reached forward, took his pencil and added a faint line. A scarf, I realized, around the tall man's neck. He shaded it green, a precise, deliberate touch. Holmes's eyes sharpened. A green scarf. Interesting. The boy's hand moved again. He drew beneath the man's coat what looked like a small circle on the belt, perhaps a buckle or something else entirely. Then he set the pencil down and turned his face slightly toward Holmes, his eyes wide but solemn. Holmes gave a small, rare smile. "Thank you, Thomas. That is more helpful than you know." We left the room in silence, descending the stairs as the grandfather clock chimed 10:30. Holmes said nothing until we reached the corridor that led to the study. There he turned to Colonel Mortimer, who had waited with growing impatience. "Colonel, who among your staff or regular visitors wears a green scarf?" Mortimer blinked. "A green scarf? That's oddly specific." Holmes merely waited. "Let me think. The gardener? No. The butler wears black. The vicar sometimes visits. No scarf. Wait. There is someone, Mr. Leonard Tunstall, my late brother-in-law's former solicitor. He dines here occasionally, often stays overnight in the guest wing. I recall his scarf clearly now. Silk. Emerald green. He fancies himself a dandy. Has he been here recently? Why, yes, he was here the night Beckett died, left that morning before the police arrived." Holmes's eyes lit with intensity. "Was his presence known to the authorities?" "No, he had gone before the constable arrived. I didn't think it relevant." "Was he in the study with Beckett that night?" "Possibly. I wasn't tracking everyone's movements, I admit. But Lady Carrington spoke with him after supper, I believe." "Why? Do you suspect him?" "I suspect many things," Holmes said coolly, "but what I know is that the child remembers him. More precisely, he remembers the scarf and something on the man's belt, possibly a watch or a case. I'll summon him immediately." "No, that would be premature. If Tunstall is our man, he will be watching events very closely. The attack on the footman suggests he fears discovery. We must give him no reason to flee." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, we must visit the study again. I have an idea. An experiment, if you will, but first I must confirm a theory regarding the soot." We returned to the scene of the crime. Holmes instructed Colonel Mortimer to stay outside the room, while we examined the hearth. He dropped to one knee and pulled out a small magnifying lens from his pocket. "See here, Watson," he murmured, pointing inside the grate. "Do you notice these scratches on the inner wall of the fireplace? Consistent with something being inserted recently. And look, smears of wax along the metal lining." "Wax?" I repeated, surprised. "Yes. As I suspected, someone used the fireplace not for fire, but for transmission. I believe a message or object was delivered to the study via the pipe we saw earlier, perhaps even after the room had been locked. There's also the possibility of light, an intentional signal. To whom? To Beckett, or perhaps even Thomas? But I am now convinced that Beckett's death was not opportunistic, it was calculated. The scene was staged to appear closed and inexplicable. A puzzle box murder, as it were. But why Beckett? What did he know? Holmes stood and began to pace. Beckett was trusted by Thomas. He may have heard or seen something prior to the event, perhaps involving Tunstall. If Beckett confided in the boy, then the killer's concern would be twofold: silence the manservant and neutralize the child's capacity to communicate, which he attempted to do by shock and possibly fear. Precisely. At that moment, a servant entered timidly and announced that Lady Carrington wished to speak with Holmes. We followed the maid to the drawing-room, where the lady of the house stood near the window, clutching a letter. "This came by post this evening," she said, handing it to Holmes. "There is no return address." Holmes examined the envelope, then slit it open with a letter opener from the mantel. As he read, his lips thinned. "Watson," he said after a moment. "Read this." It was a short message, typed in uneven ink on plain paper. "You meddle at your peril. Leave the matter rest or more blood will be drawn. The boy sees too much. Send him away or suffer the consequence." The air in the room seemed to tighten. Lady Carrington's hand trembled slightly. "What does it mean?" "It means," Holmes said grimly, "that our man grows desperate. He knows the child is the key." He folded the letter and tucked it into his coat. "Colonel, Lady Carrington, do nothing unusual. Maintain the household as if nothing has changed. Watson? And I will stay nearby for the evening. Lady Carrington nodded. Do you think he'll try something again? I would stake my reputation on it, Holmes said, and this time we shall be ready. The hours that followed were steeped in an uneasy hush, the great Carrington house seeming to hold its breath. Holmes and I took up position in a small drawing room on the ground floor that offered a discreet view of the eastern corridor, where both the study and Thomas's bedroom were located. The gas lights had been turned low to avoid casting silhouettes through the lace curtains, and Holmes had instructed the staff, in his own measured way, to behave with absolute normalcy. Lady Carrington had taken Thomas to her own chambers for the evening under Holmes's strict suggestion that the boy not be left alone under any circumstance. Colonel Mortimer, though reluctant, agreed to play his part as well, wandering the halls visibly concerned, as if all were still shrouded in uncertainty. The note had made its threat clear. The perpetrator feared exposure through the child, and Holmes intended to use that fear as bait. For hours Holmes sat without speaking, the flame of a single oil lamp catching the glint in his eyes as he stared into the dark corridor, listening. I confess I grew increasingly restless. Every floorboard, creak, every distant clang from the kitchen set my nerves further on edge. It was some time past 1 when Holmes stirred. A soft sound had drifted down the corridor, a whisper barely audible, like fabric brushing against wallpaper. Holmes rose silently and placed a finger to his lips. I followed him without a word, my revolver tucked firmly into my coat pocket. We moved swiftly but with caution, passing the heavy grandfather clock and stopping near the end of the hall just before the study door. It stood ajar. Holmes crouched and examined the lock with a small bull's-eye lantern. A faint shimmer clung to the metal. He touched it with his gloved finger and sniffed. Grease, he whispered. Recently applied. Inside the study, a figure moved in near total darkness. We could make out only the faintest outline. A tall man with a narrow build, wearing a dark coat. Holmes tensed. As the figure moved toward the fireplace, Holmes acted. Hold where you are, he said crisply, stepping into the room and striking a match to light the wall sconce. The intruder froze, half-turned, caught in the amber glow of the flickering flame. It was Leonard Tunstall. He straightened slowly, brushing a hand across his coat as if to compose himself. Mr. Holmes, he said, forcing a smile. What an unexpected hour to meet. Holmes's expression remained unreadable. Indeed. Most visitors do not conduct private investigations by lantern light at 1 o'clock in the morning, nor do they tamper with locks. Your purpose here? Tunstall's eyes flicked to the hearth, then back to Holmes. Curiosity. I returned to fetch a document I left behind on my last visit. Mortimer had mentioned Beckett often kept papers in the drawer by the mantel. A plausible excuse, Holmes said coldly. Yet your method of entry betrays a different intent. I stepped forward. We could call for Colonel Mortimer, or the Yard. Tunstall raised his hands slightly. Gentlemen, I meant no harm. I feared my presence at the house that night might be misinterpreted. Holmes did not move. Then, allow me to offer an interpretation of my own. He crossed to the fireplace and pointed to the panel behind the grate. This house contains a hidden pipe, a relic of its Victorian architecture, once used for communication between rooms. It connects this study to a corridor behind the laundry. Earlier tonight, someone used it again, not to speak but to send a signal. I believe you were attempting to retrieve the object used for that purpose. Tunstall hesitated. You see, Holmes continued, there was wax on the hearth's iron lip. It suggests the use of a candle or small lamp, perhaps used to project, flickering light through the pipe. A code, perhaps. Beckett saw it or knew of it and was lured into the room under the pretense of secrecy. What followed was murder, not messy, not impulsive, but efficient, calculated. So you have no proof of that, Tunstall said, though his voice was quieter now. On the contrary, I have something better than proof. I have a witness, one who saw not only the act itself, but the details that give you away. A green scarf, a silver case on your belt, and now, your presence here trying to cover your tracks. Tunstall took a step backward, but Holmes raised a hand. Don't, I assure you. The only exit is through us. Then came a sound that startled us all. Footsteps behind. Colonel Mortimer appeared in the doorway, clad in his dressing gown and holding a revolver of his own. "Tunstall," he said grimly. "I trusted you. You knew my sister's estate as if it were your own." Tunstall's shoulders sagged. "You don't understand, Julius. I had no choice." Holmes gave a slight nod. "Then perhaps you'll enlighten us." Tunstall's eyes darted between us. The air was thick with the heat of unraveling truths. "I was in debt," he began. "Deep debt. I never told Daphne or you. I managed the estate's legal affairs for years. It started with small diversions of funds, things I thought I could cover. But Beckett found discrepancies in the ledgers. He confronted me, said he'd give me a week to come clean or he would. "So you killed him," I said quietly. Tunstall looked down. "I didn't plan to, but that night I signaled him to meet me in the study. I knew the house well, knew which doors locked from the inside. I showed him the false balance sheets, tried to reason with him. He threatened to go to Lady Carrington. I snapped. There was a letter opener on the desk. One strike, he collapsed. It wasn't supposed to. God, it wasn't meant to go that far." Holmes's voice cut in sharply. "And the child?" I didn't know he'd seen. He must have been in the hall, or perhaps he peeked in. But when I heard he was drawing what he saw, I panicked. I tried to make it look like a sealed room mystery. I greased the lock, left through the servants' corridor, and bolted the window behind me. Then I returned to my guest room and left, before dawn. When the drawings began, I feared it was only a matter of time. "Which is why you returned tonight? To remove the evidence or to ensure the child's silence?" Tunstall looked pained. "I would never hurt the boy. I only wanted the sketch, the one with the fireplace, that soot mark. I didn't realize what it meant until you came asking questions." Colonel Mortimer stepped forward. "Holmes?" Holmes nodded. "Send for Inspector Gregson. There's no more to learn here. He's confessed, and the boy can finally sleep." And with that Holmes turned, the flickering light behind him casting his long shadow across the room. I followed, filled with both awe and relief. The mystery had been intricate, the truth grim, but the child's silent art had proven mightier than any spoken word. Holmes and I waited in the study while Colonel Mortimer rode to the village constabulary to summon Inspector Gregson. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the branches of the old yew tree just beyond the window swayed and tapped against the panes like skeletal fingers. Tunstall had been placed under watch in the morning room under the supervision of 2 footmen, and the house had once again lapsed into a muted vigil. Holmes sat alone in an armchair by the fireplace, his eyes half-lidded but bright with thought. I was about to speak when he lifted a hand, as though brushing away a distraction. "There is still something missing, Watson," he said finally, low and crisp. "The crime is solved, or appears to be, but one question gnaws at me. Something does not sit quite right." I frowned. "You doubt Tunstall's confession?" "Not the confession itself, no, but the arrangement of it all. His motivation? His method, the circumstances. Each piece fits into place too neatly. You recall how he described Beckett's response? That he gave him a week to confess? Yes, and that Tunstall acted in desperation once Beckett refused to stay silent. Stay silent. Holmes nodded slowly. "Indeed, but that implies a man willing to murder before he had exhausted his alternatives. Desperation alone cannot account for such a coldly calculated plan. The use of the signal pipe, the sealed room illusion, the attempt to retrieve the child's drawing. This was not panic, this was planning. Someone used Tunstall's guilt as a lever." I sat up. "Are you suggesting he didn't act alone?" "I am not merely suggesting it, I am certain of it." "But then who—" At that moment, a soft knock interrupted our thoughts. Lady Carrington entered the study, her face pale but composed, her hands clasped tightly together. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said quietly. "I came to ask if Thomas is safe now." Holmes rose courteously. "The immediate danger has passed, Lady Carrington. But the full truth, I believe, is yet to come to light." She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "I believe someone else was involved in this tragedy, someone who has not yet revealed themselves." She hesitated, the shadows beneath her, eyes deepening. "You mean Tunstall didn't act alone?" Holmes studied her carefully. "He acted, but not unprompted. His confession bears the hallmarks of a man cornered, but also, curiously, of one protecting someone else. She gave a weak smile. He always did think too highly of people who didn't deserve it. Indeed, Holmes said mildly. Might I ask who he held in such esteem? She looked away. My late husband, for one, and Colonel Mortimer, though I fear Julius never quite reciprocated. But why do you ask, Mr. Holmes? Because, Lady Carrington, you are a woman of intelligence and discernment. You see far more than you admit. I wonder, for instance, what you knew of Tunstall's finances. She stiffened. I suspected there were irregularities, yes, but I never pressed. I knew his pride, and I thought perhaps if given time, but you did not intervene. No, she said after a pause, and that is my failing. Holmes turned slightly, his hands behind his back. Beckett was not only your servant, but your confidant, was he not? She looked startled. He was loyal, kind. He adored Thomas. He told you of Tunstall's embezzlement. A silence. Then in a whisper, yes. I glanced at Holmes, surprised. You knew? He nodded faintly. It was the child who told me. Not with words, but with a drawing. In one of the pages Thomas gave me, there was an image of Beckett, seated at the piano with Lady Carrington beside him, her hand on his shoulder. The composition was intimate, almost reverential. Children draw what they see and what they sense. Lady Carrington looked away, her eyes glistening. You feared scandal, Holmes said gently, and you asked Beckett not to go to the authorities. Perhaps you hoped to pay off the debt quietly. Yes, she whispered. But Beckett was firm. He said it was not about money, it was about trust, about protecting Thomas. He had overheard Tunstall speaking to someone on the telephone, someone who called him client. It wasn't just embezzlement. He was selling information, estate holdings, names, even family secrets. I didn't want to believe it until it was too late. Who else knew? No one. Holmes turned to me. And yet, Tunstall's desperation drove him to murder not out of fear of legal ruin, but because his back was to the wall in another direction. If someone was paying him, blackmailing him, or threatening him, then that person still walks free. But who would... Just then, a servant entered hurriedly. Inspector Gregson has arrived, sir. Holmes nodded and excused himself with a polite word to Lady Carrington. We found Gregson waiting at the main hall, coat damp from the mist and expression keen with interest. He shook Holmes's hand heartily. Another tight knot you've unpicked, Holmes. It is not unpicked yet, Holmes said. Tunstall awaits in the morning room. He'll offer you a tidy confession, but treat it as only a beginning, not the end. Gregson arched a brow but gave a grunt of understanding. You suspect he's covering for someone? I suspect he was manipulated, Holmes said, and the key may still lie in that boy's drawings. With that, Holmes turned abruptly and made for the stairs. Where are you going? I asked, following. To the library, he said. There is one place we have not yet examined thoroughly, somewhere where secrets might have been kept not in whispers, but in ink. Within minutes we reached the library, a high-ceilinged room of oak-panelled walls and dozens of shelves brimming with leather-bound volumes. Holmes began scanning the shelves with a purposeful eye. Then he stopped before a tall case in the far corner, where a globe stood half-turned beside a stack of outdated almanacs. He pulled at one of the books, a faux volume, and a shallow compartment clicked open behind it. Inside were several sheets of parchment, a thick envelope, and a ledger. Holmes withdrew the envelope and opened it. Inside were bank drafts, foreign and domestic. More damning still, a set of receipts tied to a known Parisian broker affiliated with a well-known blackmail circle. Not just a thief, Holmes said quietly. Tunstall was a pawn. Someone was buying secrets from him, and whoever it was had something on him, something so powerful it drove him to kill rather than confess. Holmes turned the final page of the ledger, then froze. Watson, look. Scrawled at the bottom of the page in a looping hand were the initials E.C. Eliza Carrington, I whispered. No, Holmes said, eyes narrowing. Eustace Carrington. Her late husband. You think he was involved? More than involved. I believe these dealings began during his lifetime. Tunstall simply inherited the debts and the threats. Whoever EC reported to is still pulling strings. And they're still watching this house. Holmes closed the ledger and looked toward the window, as if expecting a silhouette to appear in the mist beyond. "The game, Watson," he murmured, "has widened. What began as a child's drawing may well uncover an entire web of betrayal." I felt the first true chill of the case then, not from the cold, but from the realization that even now, with one man in custody and a confession in hand, the true architect of the crime remained unseen, and quite possibly very near. Holmes stood motionless for a long moment, the ledger still open in his hands, his eyes fixed on the initials like a man considering a cipher that refuses to yield. I watched him in silence, knowing better than to interrupt. At last he closed the volume gently, as though it were not merely paper and ink, but a living testimony, a dead man's last whisper. "If Eustace Carrington was the originator of these dealings," Holmes said softly, "then Tunstall was merely a steward of his unfinished business, but that business did not perish with Carrington's death. It continued, and someone ensured it would remain secret even if it meant blood." "But who?" I asked. "You said earlier that someone used Tunstall. If it wasn't Lady Carrington—" "It wasn't," Holmes said flatly. "She may have erred by silence, but there's no calculation in her grief, and I do not believe she's capable of orchestrating Tunstall's fear." "Then who would benefit from the suppression of these ledgers, from continuing the blackmail even after Eustace died?" Holmes's gaze flicked to the window. "That, my dear Watson, is what we must now determine. We need to examine not only the past, but the power structures still present in this house. Who knew of the secret ledger? Who stood to lose if its contents were discovered? And you believe the answer lies in the estate itself?" "Exactly. And we must begin with the staff, particularly those who survived the transition between Eustace's death and Lady Carrington's stewardship. There is often a servant, Watson, who sees more than he is seen, and I should very much like to know what Beckett saw in the final weeks of his life." We returned to the lower floors, where Gregson had begun taking Tunstall's formal statement. The solicitor looked haggard but calm, as though confession had released some inner coil of tension. Holmes watched him for a moment from the doorway, then turned away. "Not him," he murmured. "He's finished playing the game, but someone else is still moving pieces on the board. Drawings." He wasn't silencing a witness, he was buying time. Callow's fingers clenched, then slowly released. "And what do you intend to do with this theory, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes studied him for a long moment. "I intend," he said quietly, "to end your arrangement, permanently." Callow's laugh was dry and bitter. "You'll find I have many clients and many friends. You won't find one willing to testify." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, what time is it?" "8:30, I said, glancing at the desk clock. "Excellent. That gives Inspector Gregson time to arrive." Callow's face twitched. "You brought the police?" "Of course, you've operated in shadows for years, Mr. Callow, but shadows thin beneath scrutiny. And I dare say Scotland Yard is hungry for a case that reaches beyond one country estate." At that moment, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Gregson, flanked by a constable, entered the room with professional calm, though his eyes flicked with interest at the man behind the desk. "This him?" he asked Holmes. "Yes, Edward Callow, solicitor, extortionist, and the mind behind at least 3 blackmail rings stretching from Sussex to Yorkshire. I believe you'll find his files quite informative." Callow rose with deliberate slowness. "This is an outrage. You have no warrant." "I have enough cause for one," Gregson replied, producing a folded document. "And your agency's connection to the Carrington estate is more than sufficient for us to begin." Holmes leaned forward one last time. "One question before. You go, Callow. Was it you who suggested Tunstall lure Beckett to the study that night?" Callow stared at him, then said nothing. "That will do," Holmes murmured. "Take him, Inspector." Gregson signaled to the constable, and Callow, still expressionless, allowed himself to be led from the room. When the door closed, Holmes released a breath, and I saw the faint lines of fatigue finally begin to mark his face. "Is that the end of it?" I asked quietly. He looked at me, his eyes thoughtful. "It's the end of the network, but not the damage it caused. Beckett is dead. Tunstall is finished, And the child, Thomas, will carry the memory of that night for the rest of his life. But justice has been done, I said. Holmes nodded once. As much as it can be. Sometimes, Watson, that is the only form it can take. We stepped out into the London night, where the fog had thinned and the stars at last had begun to show. Holmes pulled his coat closer about him, and for a long while we walked in silence through the quiet streets, the echo of footsteps marking the final chapter of a case that had begun with the pencil strokes of a silent boy. The following morning broke grey and sullen, the sky pressed low against the city like a shroud. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street in the small hours, and though I had hoped for rest, I found myself restless, replaying the case in my mind, the strange architecture of deceit that had been erected around a single crime, and the quiet genius of the child who had begun its unravelling, with nothing but pencils and silence. Holmes rose early despite the lateness of our return. He was already at the breakfast table by the time I descended the stairs, his coffee untouched, his fingers laced before him as he stared out the window with the air of a man not yet done with the matter. I presume Gregson has Callow in custody. By now, I asked, settling across from him. Yes, he'll be held pending further examination of the ledgers and correspondence, Holmes replied. But he is far too shrewd a man to have left all his dealings in a single file. There will be safe houses, secondary accounts, shell names, and accomplices, I added. Holmes nodded. Exactly. This was no solitary venture. Tunstall may have served as the local face of the affair, and Harker as the embedded eye, but Callow operated within a network of men bound by greed and mutual secrecy. The ledgers we discovered suggest at least 6 estates were compromised over the last decade. The Carringtons were merely the most recent, and regrettably the one to bring it all crashing down. I frowned. You say that as though it were inevitable. In a sense, it was. When men like Callow attach themselves to houses of wealth and reputation, they rely on silence as their most valuable currency. But when that silence is broken, when someone, even a child, begins to see, then their schemes become brittle, unsustainable. And yet, I said, the cost was high. Holmes gave a small, grim smile. Truth seldom comes cheaply, Watson. At that moment, there came a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes took it, opened it swiftly, and scanned the contents. His brow rose. It's from Gregson, he said. Callow is refusing to speak, but a search of his personal bank box yielded a list of names, clients, beneficiaries, or targets. It isn't clear. One of them, however, is most intriguing. He passed me the slip. Among a long column of names was one that stood out starkly. Julian Mortimer. Colonel Mortimer, I said, stunned. Lady Carrington's brother-in-law? The very one, Holmes said. It seems the good colonel was not merely an unfortunate relative caught in the storm, but may well have been feeding Callow information, willingly or otherwise. But why would he do such a thing? That, Holmes said, rising, we must now discover. We returned to the Carrington estate by late afternoon. The fog had returned, clinging low along the hedgerows and giving the property a spectral quality. A footman admitted us wordlessly, and we found Lady Carrington in the drawing-room, seated by the window with Thomas beside her. The boy for the first time looked up as we entered. He did not smile, but he met Holmes's gaze and gave a solemn nod. Holmes returned the gesture. He remembers everything, he murmured to me. Lady Carrington rose. Mr. Holmes, I had not expected you back so soon. There is one matter yet unresolved, Holmes said gently. May I speak with Colonel Mortimer? She glanced down the hallway. He's in the conservatory. He's been quiet all day. We found Mortimer among the hothouse ferns, staring out at the mist-cloaked gardens. He turned as we entered, his expression as composed as ever, though his eyes held a peculiar tightness. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I trust your journey was productive. Holmes did not waste time. Colonel, I'm going to ask you plainly. What was your involvement with Edward Callow? Mortimer blinked. Callow? The solicitor? Holmes withdrew the telegram from his pocket and handed it over. Mortimer read it slowly, his features darkening as he reached the name. He stood silent for a moment before exhaling through his nose. I had hoped this wouldn't surface. So you admit a connection? I admit correspondence. Years ago, after Eustace died, I found myself under financial strain. I had taken certain liberties with investments in India. When I returned to England, I needed capital. Callow approached me discreetly, said he represented a group of private lenders, no questions asked, and in return, I passed along small details, estate assessments, valuations, visitor lists, nothing that seemed dangerous, and nothing about Daphne or the boy. But Callow, he had a way of twisting things. Eventually, he told me about Eustace's past dealings. Said if I didn't cooperate, he'd release letters linking me to fraudulent transfers from a fund in Bombay. Blackmail, I said. Mortimer nodded, and I was too much the coward to confront him. I didn't know about Tunstall's involvement. I truly didn't. But when Beckett died, I feared it was all spiraling out of control. That's why I wrote to you, Holmes. I thought, perhaps, someone outside this wretched web could untangle it. Holmes regarded him for a long moment. You may yet have a chance to make things right. Provide a full statement to the Yard. Include every detail, every letter, every instruction you received. I will, Mortimer said quietly, whatever the cost. As we stepped out of the conservatory, I glanced back to see the Colonel, staring down at his hands as though measuring the weight of them. Lady Carrington met us again in the hall. Well, he's not blameless, Holmes said, but he may prove useful in prosecuting Callow's wider network. I suggest you keep a careful distance until the case concludes. She nodded gravely. And the child? He will need time, Holmes said, glancing toward Thomas. But he has courage and clarity. His gift was not only to see, but to show. What he lacked in voice, he offered in vision. Few witnesses have spoken more plainly. Holmes asked for the head housekeeper, and after a brief delay, Mrs. Newell arrived. A thin, angular woman of indeterminate age, she carried herself with the quiet gravity of someone used to overseeing order in a household perpetually on the edge of genteel chaos. Her grey eyes were alert but without warmth. You were here during Mr. Carrington's tenure, Holmes asked. 22 years, she replied. I saw the master through his last illness and remained for Lady Carrington's. Sake. Hand for the child's. Holmes inclined his head slightly. You have my respect. Few staff remain so long in private service. May I ask if you were ever aware of confidential documents being stored in the library? Mrs. Newell's eyes narrowed, ever so slightly. The master was fond of keeping his own records. He didn't trust the family solicitor with everything, if I may be frank. Then he did not trust Mr. Tunstall. He found him competent, but not discreet. There were times the master would seal his correspondence and deliver it himself. To the post. I was asked more than once not to speak of certain letters. Holmes leaned forward. Letters to whom? I don't know. He wrote under initials, sometimes to addresses in France or Vienna. I was never to ask questions. But someone did ask questions, I imagine. Someone who may have learned what was in those letters after Carrington's death. Mrs. Newell's mouth thinned. That is possible. I suppose I thought Mr. Tunstall might have taken the liberty of going through the master's things, but it wasn't my place to say. It's your place now, Holmes said. Because if someone else obtained that ledger, if they used it to threaten Tunstall or anyone else, they may have resorted to murder to preserve their advantage. She was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice almost too low to hear, she said, there was someone else who took an unusual interest. After the master died, Mr. Harker. I blinked. Who is Harker? The estate steward, she said. Hired just after Mr. Carrington's funeral. Came with a recommendation from a London agency. Polished, very polite, but always listening. Holmes's face sharpened. I haven't heard his name mentioned once since our arrival. He left, Mrs. Newell said, 3 months ago, quietly. Said he had an offer elsewhere. Did he ever speak with Beckett? Often. They would walk the grounds together. Harker was always asking questions. About Lady Carrington's management, about the child's trust fund, about old visitors. Holmes turned away and paced once in thought. And you didn't find this unusual? I did. But he was never improper, just curious. Did he leave a forwarding address? No. but I recall the agency he came from, Hobson and Clyde. Mayfair. Holmes turned to me. That's our next step, Watson. We've followed the crime backward, from drawing to child, from child to solicitor, and now from solicitor to the man who whispered behind the curtain. Harker may no longer be in the house, but his shadow remains. We took our leave of Mrs. Newell and informed Gregson of our intent to return to London. He was busy cataloguing the ledger Holmes had found and instructing his constables to preserve the compartment in the library. He offered to have Harker's details searched from the yard, but Holmes declined. "No," he said. "Too many hands will muddle the trail. I want to see the files myself." By late afternoon, we were once again within the gas-lit avenues of London, the mist thick and heavy with coal smoke. We arrived at the offices of Hobson and Clyde just off Bruton Street. The firm, a discreet and elegant affair, managed domestic placements for gentlemen's estates. After a short wait, we were shown into the office of a pale young man with meticulous hair and a narrow moustache. "Mr. Holmes?" he asked. "I've heard of your reputation. I require the placement records for a man named Tobias Harker." "Steward, you placed him with the Carrington estate following Mr. Eustace Carrington's death." The clerk pulled a ledger from the cabinet behind him. "Yes, Harker, placed under good reference. I believe he served with distinction, though he left us rather suddenly." Holmes's voice was like flint. "Where did he go next?" The clerk flipped through pages. "Ah, yes, he accepted a post with Mr. Clement Stroud, a merchant of considerable wealth in Eastbourne." Holmes nodded. "Thank you. One last question. Who provided his reference?" The man hesitated, flipping to the back of the file. "It says the reference was personal, issued by a man named Edward Callow, a solicitor, London-based." "Callow," Holmes repeated slowly. "Watson, we have our final name." He turned to me with a quiet, grave intensity. "Callow may be the linchpin. If he was connected to Eustace Carrington's financial dealings and provided Harker as his proxy, then the web leads directly to him. Tunstall's crimes were convenient, but they were also camouflage. Someone else remained hidden while the pieces were removed. We stepped out into the chill dusk, and Holmes paused before lighting his pipe. "This case began with a child's drawing," he said. "But it ends, I suspect, in a room full of papers, money, and silence. We are no longer solving a murder alone, Watson. We are about to expose a blackmail network that began with a dead man and has not yet stopped collecting the living." The evening had settled into a cold, unwavering stillness as Holmes and I made our way through the London streets toward Lincoln's Inn Fields, where the offices of Edward Callow, solicitor, were reputed to reside. The wind swept between the buildings with a knife-like sharpness, and the gas lamps threw long shadows that seemed to stretch and flinch with each gust. Holmes, however, appeared unaffected by the chill. He moved with a singular purpose, his steps quick and decisive. The collar of his coat pulled high and his face set in that mask of intense focus I had come to recognize as the harbinger of revelation. We found the office of Callow and Durrant, tucked, away on a narrow lane, its windows dark but not deserted. A dim light glowed behind a drawn curtain, and the faint click of a typewriter echoed through the door as we ascended the steps. Holmes rapped twice, sharply. A moment passed, then footsteps. The door creaked open, revealing a clerk with a cautious expression, spectacles perched precariously on the end of his nose. "Yes?" he asked, his voice clipped. "Mr. Edward Callow," Holmes said. "I am Sherlock Holmes. We require a word." The name, as always, had the desired effect. The clerk blinked, glanced nervously back into the hallway, then stepped aside without protest. "He's working late," he said. "Second door on the right." Holmes did not wait for further instruction. He moved like an arrow down the corridor, and I followed close behind. The door in question stood slightly ajar, revealing a room lit by a single green-shaded lamp. Inside, a man sat behind a mahogany desk, meticulously annotating a sheaf of papers with a gold-nibbed pen. "Mr. Callow?" Holmes said. The man looked up, his brow furrowing. He was in his 50s, trim and composed, with dark hair graying at the temples and the kind of well-kept moustache that suggested an interest in appearances. He took in Holmes, then myself, then the open door. "I don't believe we're acquainted," he said coolly. "No," said Holmes, closing the door behind us. But you are acquainted with Eustace Carrington, and with Tobias Harker, and more. Recently, with Leonard Tunstall. Callow remained still for a beat too long. Then he set his pen down and leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I see," he said. "May I assume you are here regarding the unfortunate incident at the Carrington estate?" "You may assume," said Holmes, "that I am here to dismantle the quiet little empire you've built atop the backs of the desperate." Callow smiled faintly, but his eyes did not. "Strong language, Mr. Holmes. I'm merely a solicitor. I offer advice, negotiate arrangements. You plant men in wealthy households," Holmes said, cutting across him. "You extract secrets quietly, surgically. When a man like Carrington begins misappropriating funds, you step in and offer solutions. Not retribution, not correction, just privacy, at a cost." "That sounds like conjecture." Holmes reached into his coat and pulled from an envelope a single sheet of paper, the ledger page bearing the initials EC. This came from a locked compartment in Carrington's personal library. It contains entries signed with initials that match the original correspondence records of your firm, entries linked to accounts in Geneva and Prague, and, most damning of all, a list of estates where you placed recommended stewards. Harker among them. Callow's facade remained intact, but I could see the smallest quiver at the corner of his mouth. "You have no idea what circles you're meddling in, Mr. Holmes." "I have every idea," Holmes replied. "You made your fortune trafficking in sins you didn't commit, just arranged. You found men like Carrington and Tunstall, and offered them lifelines they thought came without consequence. And when those men faltered, you replaced them with agents loyal to you, like Harker." Callow's voice lowered, more cautious now. "You can't prove I ordered Beckett's death." Holmes stepped forward. "I don't need to, not yet. Tunstall's confession places him at the scene, but his fear, his desperation, were born from your threats. You made it clear that, if he didn't manage the situation, you would. That's why he tried to retrieve the child's. Lady Carrington's expression softened. "Then perhaps he can begin to heal." We took our leave as dusk crept over the hedges. In the carriage back to the station, Holmes sat in thoughtful silence, watching the fog thread its way through the trees like spilled ink. "You see, Watson," he said at last, "this was never merely a locked-room mystery or a tale of betrayal. It was a story of inheritance, of what we passed down, intentionally or not. Eustace left behind more than papers. He left shadows. And Thomas? Thomas revealed them. In silence, yes, but with greater truth than all the men who tried to speak. I said nothing, letting the weight of those words settle. And as the train bore us back toward London, the case, though concluded, did not feel finished. For in the quiet space between Holmes's thoughts and my pen, I knew the boy's drawings would remain with me, not only as clues, but as a haunting reminder of what the innocent see and when the rest of us are blind. The carriage swayed gently as the train made its way toward London, the muffled rhythm of the wheels blending with the low hum of distant conversation. Holmes sat across from me, his gaze fixed out the window, though I could tell his mind had already departed the train and was mapping connections elsewhere, moving down corridors of thought that only he could navigate. Despite the unraveling of Callow's scheme and the unexpected confession of Colonel Mortimer, I sensed Holmes was not entirely satisfied. He had closed the circuit of guilt, yes, but I had long since learned that it was not closure Holmes sought. It was coherence, and something I suspected still eluded his complete understanding. "Holmes," I said finally, "you've uncovered every link in the chain. What more remains?" He did not turn, but I saw his reflection in the glass, eyes narrowed. "Watson," he said quietly, "what does a spider do when its web is torn?" I considered the metaphor. "It rebuilds, I suppose." Just so Callow was the visible strand, one we were able to pull, but webs like his don't exist in isolation. They spread. They anchor to walls far beyond what we can see. He was part of something larger. I believe the name we have not yet spoken is the one holding the last strand. And whose name is that? Holmes's gaze returned to me at last. "Harker." I blinked. "But you said he was a plant, Callow's man." "Indeed, but I suspect Harker was more than that. He disappeared too conveniently, too quietly. And more to the point, We never truly uncovered his motive. He served as the observer within the house, yes, but who was he reporting to after Callow? I frowned. You think someone has already filled Callow's shoes? I think someone never left them. The rest of the journey passed in pensive silence, Holmes's thoughts racing while mine struggled to keep up. By the time we reached Baker Street, night had fully fallen, and the fog hung low and silver over the pavement. Back in our sitting room, Holmes threw off his coat and lit the fire with restless energy. "We need to locate Harker," he said. "Immediately." "I thought he had no forwarding address." "None provided to Hobson and Clyde," Holmes replied, "but we have other methods." He crossed to the desk and retrieved a small book, already dog-eared and creased with use, his Private Index of Informants and Street Contacts. Scanning it quickly, he paused at a name. "Watson, if you'd be so good as to accompany me. We are going to pay a visit to a man who once tracked a forger from Dublin to Prague using nothing more than a torn envelope and a shipping manifest. We took a hansom across the river to Southwark, where Holmes's contact, a slight man with red-rimmed eyes and the scent of old paper clinging to him, worked in a cluttered back room of a shipping office. Introductions were brief. Holmes's reputation rendered formality unnecessary. "We're looking for a man named Tobias Harker," Holmes explained. "He left London within the last 3 months, possibly under a false name, former steward to the Carrington estate in Hampstead." The man Garvey scratched at his stubbled chin. "That name I've heard. Got a brother in customs who mentioned a man by that name booked passage to Antwerp 6 weeks ago. Travelling light. Paid cash." "Alone?" Holmes asked. "No. Travelled. With another gentleman. Name given was Rawle. Thin, well-dressed, didn't speak much." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Edward Callow had a cousin by that name." "Lionel Rawle, a former barrister struck from the rolls for breach of client confidentiality." Garvey grinned. "Sounds like your man. My brother said they took a private room on the ship and kept to themselves. Next ship due from Antwerp docks, in Tilbury tomorrow morning." Holmes rose. "Then we'll be there to meet it." By the following dawn, we stood along the edge of the Tilbury docks, wrapped against the cold. The ferry from Antwerp rolled in through the fog with the slow inevitability of something ancient and blind. As the gangplank was lowered, Holmes stepped back slightly into the shadow of a stack of crates, his eyes scanning every figure that disembarked. It was not long before 2 men emerged, one taller, broad of shoulder, and moving with a bureaucrat's stiffness. The other lean and sharply dressed, eyes flicking nervously from side to side. "That's him," Holmes murmured. "Harker. And the second, Rawle." We moved quickly, Holmes signalling 2 yard men waiting nearby. In moments, the pair had been intercepted and taken to a nearby warehouse, where Holmes conducted the interrogation with practiced calm. Rawle broke first. Faced with Holmes's precision and Gregson's steady presence, the man confessed that Callow had instructed him to retrieve the ledger from the Carrington estate, and failing that, to silence any loose ends. Harker had been his point of contact, within the house. Holmes leaned over the table. "And was it you who attacked the footman, Patrick?" Rawle hesitated, then nodded. "He was getting close. Beckett had trusted him. We thought he'd found the pipe connection." "And the message to Lady Carrington?" "That wasn't us," Rawle said. "That was Harker. Said it would rattle. The boy. Make the family consider sending him away. Easier to extract the drawings that way." Holmes's expression darkened. "And the drawing?" "Never found. But Callow was convinced the child had seen something important. Something he couldn't forget." Holmes straightened. "Then that will be your undoing. You underestimated the boy and the truth." Later that morning, after the arrests were complete, we returned once more to Hampstead. Lady Carrington greeted us at the door with a look of wary hope. Thomas stood behind her, not clinging but present, watchful. Holmes crouched to his level and produced the final drawing from his pocket, the one Thomas had added to, showing the green scarf, the silver buckle, the mantel clock. "You did well." "Thomas," he said gently, "what you remembered helped stop very bad people. You protected your family." Thomas looked at him, then at his grandmother, then reached out and took the paper from Holmes's hand. He turned it over and began to draw. Holmes and I watched in silence as he worked, calmly, deliberately. The strokes were confident now, no longer urgent with fear. When he was done, he handed the page back to Holmes. It showed a train, two figures standing together on the platform, one tall and angular, the other shorter, with a moustache and hat. Above them a rising sun. Holmes studied it for a long moment, then smiled. "Come, Watson," he said quietly. "Our case is finished." And for the first time in many days, I saw Holmes relax, not with triumph, but with a rare sense of peace. The mystery had begun with silence, with a child who drew what he could not say, and it had ended with that same child, at last drawing not danger or fear, but safety, a return, a conclusion, and perhaps even a beginning. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street by early afternoon, the air crisp with the promise of winter, though the sky remained a sullen slate grey. London had resumed its usual din. Omnibuses rattled over the cobbles, and the cries of newspaper boys echoed through the damp streets, but within the walls of our sitting room a quieter atmosphere prevailed. A kettle steamed gently on the hob, and Holmes, uncharacteristically still, stood at the window with his back to me, his hands clasped behind him. I said nothing for a while, letting the silence settle. Then, as he continued to stare out at the shifting fog, I ventured, "You're thinking of the boy?" Holmes turned slightly, not surprised. "Yes, Watson. He is safe, and yet he remains on my mind. Children, as you know, are not often participants. In our cases, at least not as witnesses in the truest sense. They observe without interpretation. They do not invent motive. They see. And in that pure observation, there is an honesty that we too often ignore." I nodded. He may not have spoken, but I suspect no one in that household saw more clearly than he did. Holmes tapped his long fingers against the sill, then moved to the desk and unrolled the final drawing Thomas had given him. The sketch of the two men on the train platform, one tall, the other with a moustache, stood between faint pillars of morning light. It was, to my eyes, a gesture of closure. To Holmes, I believed it was something more. "He marked the end," Holmes said. "That drawing is not only symbolic of our departure, but of his. From fear, from silence. He no longer needs to recount what he saw, because he has processed it through the one method he trusts. His drawings," I said quietly. Holmes gave a small nod, then folded the page carefully and slid it into a file marked with the case's details. He placed it in the top drawer of the cabinet near the fire, where only the most personally affecting cases found their place. We sat for a time, not speaking, until a knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson admitted Inspector Gregson, whose overcoat still bore a dusting of soot from the train yards. "You've read the reports from Tilbury, I assume?" he said, settling himself in the armchair opposite Holmes. "Rawle has given us all we could have hoped for. He'll be remanded until trial, as will Harker. And Callow." He gave a short exhalation through his nose. "He's already petitioned for a private hearing. He'll try to bury this in legal proceedings, but the Crown's case is sound." Holmes reached for the folder again, but didn't open it. "You'll find there are further documents among Callow's effects, coded ledgers, anonymous trusts. You may even find names that sit in Parliament." Gregson's brow lifted. "You think this goes that far?" "I know it does," Holmes replied. "But expose too much too quickly, and you'll never reach the ones who matter. Proceed with caution. Follow the money." Gregson gave a grim smile. "Coming from you, that almost sounds like praise." "It's advice," Holmes said. "Don't mistake it for kindness." Gregson rose and pulled on his gloves. "In any case, I'll be in touch. The Yard owes you a debt, Mr. Holmes." "Not at all," Holmes replied. "We owe it to a boy who wouldn't speak but refused to forget." When the door closed behind him, I stirred. "And is that it, then? The case closed?" Holmes regarded the fire for a moment. "It is concluded in the practical sense, yes. The players are known, their roles defined. The law will pursue what it can. But Watson," he turned to me and his voice dropped slightly, "we uncovered a single chamber of a house with many rooms. This particular corridor of corruption, estate, embezzlement, domestic blackmail, information brokering. It does not begin or end with Edward Callow. It is systemic. There will be others. And will you pursue them?" I asked. Holmes was quiet for a moment. "I may." or I may wait. Let the next strand be drawn to me." I watched him closely. There was no vanity in his tone, no pride, only a cold sort of resolve. The following days passed uneventfully, though not without reflection. The newspapers, ever hungry for sensation, seized the story with vigor. The Evening Standard dubbed it "The Hampstead House of Shadows." Another column called it "The Case of the Silent Witness." They printed embellished accounts of the locked-room murder of the secret pipe system and of the mysterious drawings by a mute child that cracked the case. Holmes's name, as always, was woven through the reporting, though he declined all interview requests with quiet contempt. I visited the Carrington estate one final time a week later, this time alone. Lady Carrington met me in the parlour, and though the strain of recent weeks still lingered in her features, there was colour in her cheeks and warmth in her voice. "Thomas is upstairs," she said, "reading. He reads now, Dr. Watson. Not only draws, he's still quiet, but the silence is his again, not fear's." I offered her the package Holmes had prepared, a small bound collection of the child's recovered sketches, copied and preserved with care. At the end, Holmes had added a note in his spare, elegant hand. "To Thomas, who saw truth when others would not." Sach, Lady Carrington held the volume with both hands. "He will treasure this. You both gave him more than you know." I smiled faintly. He gave us more than he realizes. We parted with mutual respect, and as I made my way back toward the city, I found my thoughts returning not to Callow or Rawle, nor even to the unraveled mystery of Beckett's death, but to the boy and to the peculiar genius of Holmes, who had pieced together a silent story from images alone. Back at Baker Street, Holmes had resumed his usual rhythm. The violin returned to his hands. Books once again formed towers along the carpet. He neither referenced the case nor alluded to any future pursuits for the rest of that week. But one evening, as I was setting aside my writing and preparing to leave, Holmes spoke from the window, where he stood with the fog curling around the panes like smoke. "Watson," he said, "yes? There are cases that demand logic, and others, intuition. This one demanded patience and faith. And faith in what?" I asked. "In what cannot be spoken? In what a child sees when no one listens? We are too often deaf to the quietest voices." I nodded. "Not this time." He gave a small, wistful smile. "No, not this time." And so it was that the case of the child who drew the crime scene came to its end, not with triumph but with understanding. And in that understanding, perhaps, a rare piece for both Holmes and the boy who had, without a word, drawn the truth into the light. The fireplace in our Baker Street sitting room crackled gently, casting long shadows along the shelves that lined the walls. Outside, London was caught in one of its early winter storms, a soft but persistent rain tapping against the window panes. It was the kind of afternoon that invited reflection, and I, for my part, had taken to reviewing my notes from the Carrington affair, attempting to organize them into some form suitable for publication. Holmes, meanwhile, sat opposite, his chair drawn close to the hearth, his hands steepled beneath his chin, his eyes closed, but his mind, I knew, anything but idle. It had been nearly a fortnight since the final pieces of the mystery had come to rest. Edward Callow was awaiting trial, his web of silent influence now thoroughly exposed by Gregson's careful investigations, guided, in no small part, by Holmes's methodical deductions. Rawle and Harker had turned state's evidence in exchange for leniency, revealing the extent of the operation. A quiet siphoning of influence and information from the drawing rooms and studies of England's great houses, masked behind a veil of professional discretion and solicitors' jargon. It was, as Holmes had called it, a refined criminality. No vulgar violence until the very end, when fear had overtaken strategy, and yet, despite its apparent resolution, something about the case had lingered with Holmes more deeply than "Post? You know, Watson," he said at length, his voice low, "there was a time when a man like Callow would never have been permitted near the gates of a family like the Carringtons. But society's appetite for secrecy has changed. It no longer fears exposure. It merely prices it." I looked up from my notes. "You believe we've only delayed the inevitable?" "I believe we've disturbed one colony," he replied. "The Queen has been caught, yes, but the hive He paused, then let the sentence trail off. Well, it may take longer to dismantle. I understood his meaning. The case had revealed more than a murder. It had laid bare the structure beneath. The act, the rot hidden within civility. But even so, we had done what we could. And Holmes, I sensed, had found something in this case that was rare for him. Not merely challenge or vindication, but something approaching personal resonance. "Holmes," I said gently, "you saw yourself in that child, didn't you?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then, with uncharacteristic softness, he said, "Perhaps, or perhaps I merely recognized a mind too young to carry what it had seen, yet burdened with it nonetheless. He didn't run from it, Watson. He committed it to paper. That, I think, was an act of bravery greater than any confession." We sat in silence for a moment more. Then he rose and crossed to the cabinet, where he retrieved the small folder containing Thomas Carrington's drawings. He opened it with care as though it were a case file and drew out the final sketch, the one of the train platform with the tall figure and the smaller, moustached one beneath the rising sun. "He knew it was over," Holmes said. "And he told us not in words but in symbols. That boy solved the case long before we did." I smiled. "You solved the case, Holmes." He gave a slight shake of the head. "No, Watson. I interpreted the case. Thomas revealed it." It was not often I heard such humility from him, and never without good cause. I knew then that this case would remain with him, not because of the puzzle, but because of the clarity it required. A clarity not derived from deduction, but from empathy. That evening a letter arrived, hand-delivered by a uniformed boy and addressed in Lady Carrington's firm hand. "Mr. Holmes, Thomas has begun to speak again. A few words at first, names, objects, then sentences. Yesterday he asked me what justice meant. I tried to explain it as best I could, and he nodded and went back to drawing. He seems lighter now. I do not pretend to understand all that passed between you and him, but I know that he felt seen, and for that I will be forever in your debt." Daphne Carrington Holmes read the letter twice. Then he folded it neatly and placed it in the drawer beside the sketches. "Well, Watson," he said with a faint smile, "perhaps we did some good after all." "You never doubted it?" He gave a non-committal shrug. "I only doubted whether it would be recognized. As the rain eased and the fire sank to a slow, golden burn, I returned to my writing. I knew that the story I would tell this time would differ from those that came before. The deductions, the clues, the dramatic reveal, those would remain, of course, but so too would the image of a silent boy, sitting cross-legged on a floor in Hampstead, showing the world a murder that no one else could see. Holmes leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes once more, a rare peace in his expression. And thy recorder, companion, and witness realized that we had not merely solved a case. We had, in our own small way, helped a child find his voice again, and that, in all of Holmes's vast and storied career, might prove to be one of his greatest triumphs.